Hello everybody, and welcome again back to the Working Class Movement Library. And we are going to be welcoming, even if virtually, somebody whose association with WCML, like that of last week's speaker, goes back a very long way. Michael Herbert is a WCML volunteer, and he's going to be speaking to us about Doctor Who writer Malcolm Hulke, with the emphasis on how his political views fed into his work. Our events are, as usual, free. However, we would encourage you to support the library if you are able to do so, and there is a donate button on our webpage. So I'm going to hand over to Michael, and before I start the presentation, we have a very special guest. So Michael, if you'd like to explain that, that would be great.
Right, good afternoon and welcome everybody to the talk today about Malcolm Hulke. So we're very pleased to welcome at the start of our talk today Katie Manning, who played Jo Grant in Doctor Who in the 1970s and appeared in 3 of Malcolm Hulke's serials for Doctor Who. And those were The Sea Devils, Colony in Space, and Frontier in Space. Titles were shorter in those days. So Katie's very kindly agreed to share her memories of Mac, as everyone kind of knows him, at the time when she was making Doctor Who. So welcome, Katie, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. Sorry I'm not being pictured, but there's a very good reason for that. I'm actually in a dark room with a large patch over my eye and sunglasses. And you're wearing John Pertwee's hair, I think.
Especially grown for the occasion. Yeah.
I was going to say, especially bouffanted for today. Anyway, thank you so much for inviting me.
From what you were saying to me in Twitter and a bit earlier, the way it worked was that you tended to meet the writers at the start of when you were sort of presumably reading through.
Well, not always. No, they weren't always at the read-through, because you have to, scripts were often, they were accepted, sometime before. And then Terence Dix, of course, our script editor, would edit those scripts. So there were quite a few times when we actually didn't see the writer. I did meet Malcolm a couple of times up in the BBC bar where you meet everybody. And he was a sweet and lovely man and very interesting. And you were saying about, the political aspects of his writing, which I think, just mentioning the Sea Devils and Frontier in Space, I think we can see that there was quite a lot of that. There was an adventure going on, but there was something underneath, which I think is quite good in our era. I think there was a lot of that. And in The Green Death, obviously, I did only read, because he didn't write The Green Death for the actual television series, but I did come back from Australia. And first thing I had to do was to read the Green Death Target novel, which is very male orientated. I mean, I played so many Welsh miners and army folk and so on. But he was a really interesting writer, Malcolm. And as I say, if you look at the Sea Devils, which is still very popular to this day, there's a lot of undercurrents in there, which are and certainly about bureaucracy.
Lots of undercurrent because he was shot underwater.
Well, yeah.
What you said to me very kindly in an email or a tweeter to be more was that you felt that you always trusted his writing.
Absolutely. That was, something that during my time on Doctor Who, I did feel that we were blessed with some terrific writers, with Bob Baker and Don Houghton and so on. And Malcolm Hulke was a writer that I think everybody was very aware of. And you knew when you saw his name on a script that it was going to be a good one. And there was going to be, as I say, what was interesting then was being able to say something, albeit slightly political, and yet never lose the sense of the adventure, which I think Malcolm Hulke was extremely good at. So it wasn't about preaching, as we say, using a dreadful pun for the Sea Devils, undercurrent. There were always those little issues there if you wanted them. And nowadays, I think people are looking at things much more under the microscope than we did back then. But no, the writer wasn't always present when we did the read-throughs and things like that. In fact, very rarely, which was interesting.
So it's very kind of you to join us today, Katie. And the things you mentioned, I'll be talking about the sort of Silurian in my talk, amongst other Doctor Who things. And also I'll be sort of explaining the sort of range of work, which is very, very wide indeed, that Malcolm Hulke did in the course of his career.
Enormous.
Yeah,
I
so,
mean, he did so much work back then. He was a very prolific writer. And I think also very trustworthy one. And he also wrote Frontier in Space, didn't he?
that's right, yes.
Yeah, well, there's another one. If you look at that, which I mean, I'm not going to sort of go into it because you will now and in much more depth. But there's also, once again, there's all little subtleties under there, which are there if you want them, which is, I think, how to write a great adventure, is you've got the adventure, but you've also got things that are being said. And he was extremely good at that because he was a man that really cared, you know, and about what was going on in the world. And
that's true.
And that makes a great Doctor Who writer.
I think that's a really good note to finish on. So we're really appreciative of you joining us today, Katie, from your darkened room, and we hope you get better soon.
I wouldn't let you down because I think it's very important for us to discuss some of those wonderful writers that we had back then, you know, and he is somebody I think that is definitely going to be of great interest to people today, not just back then, but what he was saying back then is very poignant to today. So, as I say, you have a greater knowledge of this wonderful man than I do. But when I met him, all I can say is that he was an extremely charming, a very handsome man.
Okay, thank you, Katie. That's brilliant.
Have a wonderful time, all of you, won't you? And thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Katie. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Okay, so as Lynette's indicated, today I'll be talking about Malcolm Hulke, who was a successful writer for radio, television, and the cinema from the late 50s through to the late 70s, and also wrote a number of books and novels. Malcolm was generally referred to as Mac by his family and friends, so that's what I will call him from now on in this talk. And we've got a picture here of Malcolm, probably in his sort of middle age, I think. My interest in Mac was sparked by coming across a pamphlet he wrote for Unity Theatre, which is in the collection of the Working Class Movement Library, and I'll be talking about this pamphlet in a bit more detail later. I already knew of him as a writer on Doctor Who, and therefore did some research on him, which was published as a guest post on the Lipstick Socialist blog run by Bernadette Hyland in February 2013. And since then, my sort of work on him has gone through several regenerations. So in January 2015, an extended version was published by Five Leaves Press under the title, which I couldn't resist, Doctor Who and the Communist, and copies are still available from the wonderful Five Leaves bookshop in Nottingham. In September 2015, Doctor Who magazine published an article by John Williams about Mac, which contained a great deal of new information which I hadn't been able to get hold of. This was derived very helpfully, from his MI5 file, which had been released into the National Archives in October 2014. And so I kind of updated my post on my science fiction blog now, which I call Fantasies of Possibility, which is a quote from H.G. Wells. And then, as lockdown has provided some somewhat unexpected free time, I started work a couple of weeks ago on revising this post. I've been looking into his family background and looking at more detail in the newspapers. And so that's what I'll be sort of adding to today. I was fortunate in making contact with Sally Edworthy, who very kindly sent me copies of a family bulletin written by Mac in the late 1930s when he was a teenager. And I'm very grateful for her help, and to Andrew Cartmel and Katie Manning for their comments, and also to Andrew Pixley for sending me a summary of the files on Mac and the BBC Written Archives. So in this talk, I'll be looking at Mac's early years, his membership of the Communist Party in the sort of 40s and 50s, his involvement with Unity Theatre, his writing for television, and focusing particularly on two very high-profile series, The Avengers and Doctor Who, and his union activity in the Writers' Guild, and then I'll mention some of his fiction and non-fiction. So could we have the next picture, please? This is Mac's mother, Elsie Marianne Hulke. Mac was born on the 21st of November 1924 in Hampstead. His father, or so he thought, and more of this later, was Walter Backhouse Hulke, Elsie's second husband, a retired army officer who died only a year or so after they were married. Elsie and Mac changed lodgings quite frequently when he was growing up, but by 1938 they were living in Deal, where Elsie ran a boarding house called Hardicott, and also living there was Winifred Boot, a close friend of Elsie's, who played a major role in Mac's life. Mac attended the Dover School of Art for a time, by the way. Can we have the next picture, please? So this picture is of Hardicott, and it's from the 4th issue of a family bulletin that the teenage Mac started when he very enterprisingly typed up and then circulated around his relatives with a cutting price of 2pence, by the way. An early example of Mac's lifelong belief that writers should get paid. The 5th bulletin appeared in January 1939 and was of a more sombre nature. The front page announced, "We regret to announce the death of Miss Edith Raystrick Ainsworth, who passed away at 1:30 on the 14th December 1938, whilst staying with her sister, Mrs. E.M. Hulke." And Mac continued, "For many years, Miss Ainsworth has wandered from room to room, never having a home. She had very few friends, but had a habit of talking to such people as night watchmen and strangers in storm shelters. The suddenness of her death has been a great shock to us all. I have known her all my conscious life, and I feel I've lost someone of whom I am a part." The room she occupied at Hardicott overlooked the sea. It was furnished to suit her own simple tastes, tastes which were carried out to the last. A rich purple carpet lay on a scarlet Indian carpet. 2 trestles covered with purple pals, picked out in gold and bearing the inscription IHS, supported her. At her head were 2 high oak candlesticks, which were burning golden candles which never went out. I felt, as she was carried down the steps through the garden of Hardicott, that she left her blessing there. So that's one of sort of Mac's really earliest writing. Deal was bombed by the Luftwaffe during the war on several occasions, which may explain why Elsie moved with Winifred and Mac to run another guest house, Glen Helen, at Braithwaite near Keswick, where she died on the 30th of June 1943. Could we have the next slide, please? So this is a picture of Mac in his Navy uniform. It's alleged that when he was eligible at the age of 18 to be called up into the armed forces, Mac applied to become a conscientious objector. However, I've been unable to find any records on this. It's not so easy to find records from the Second World War as it is for the First World War. Mac served in the Royal Navy as a trainee canteen manager. And could we have the next photograph, please? This is a very famous photograph, which some people may recognise, taken by Yevgeny Kaldy on the 2nd of May 1945, showing Red Army soldiers raising the Soviet flag over a shattered Berlin and a defeated Germany. Mac joined the Communist Party of Great Britain in June 1945, not, as he later wrote to a party official, because he was attracted to its Marxist philosophy, but because I just met a lot of Russian POWs in Norway, and because the Soviet army had then just rolled back the Germans. So, directed by Moscow, the Communist Party had initially opposed the war because Stalin had done a deal with Hitler in August 1939 not to attack each other. But after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, the line changed and the British Party swung fully behind the war. The party gained a great deal of prestige when the Red Army held Hitler's armies at Moscow in 1941, encircled and then broke Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army at Stalingrad in 1943, and then drove the German armies all the way back to Berlin, which they took after ferocious battle. I think you can see in the famous photograph there, the destruction of Berlin. Until he was 21, Mac believed that his father was the late Walter Backhouse Hulke, his mother's second husband, who Elsie had married in 1922. He revealed how he had found out this was not the case, and that he was illegitimate, as it used to be called, in an article he wrote for The Observer in October 1973, which he called "The Stigma You Can Never Escape." One day when I was 21, I decided to track down my father's relatives to find out why my recently dead mother always told me never to go near them. This well-to-do couple I found in a vast St. John's Wood flat offered me tea. And as she poured, the lady I thought was my aunt said, "Well, where do you think you fit into our family?" I explained I was the son of a long-dead brother and mentioned when I was born. "That's quite impossible," she said, "because my brother died 2 years before then. You take sugar." I never called again. It isn't nice to go round shocking innocent householders. When you're illegitimate, you feel completely alone. You condition us to hide it. We are the totally silent minority. Mac also found out that his birth had not been registered, and therefore he had to apply for naturalisation, as he was technically classified as an alien, ironic in the light of his later career as a writer of science fiction. His membership of the CPGB led MI5, no less, to open a file on him from 1949 onwards, and he was also investigated by the Metropolitan Police, who consulted with the police at Cumberland and concluded that this individual is a poseur and professed agnostic with an exaggerated idea of his own importance. Little reliance can be placed on his statements regarding the circumstances of his birth, and inquiry shows he is known as a man with little regard for the truth. It's very hard to see what the young Mac could have done to merit this damning verdict. A later report added, "I'm of the opinion that Hulke is inclined to undergo subversive activities, as his whole outlook was in this direction." Despite these reports, the Registrar General finally agreed to issue Mac with a special certificate of citizenship at a cost of £10 in August 1949. And could we have the next slide, please? In the post-war years, Mac lived in Gloucester Place in Marylebone, where he was active in the local branch and the YCL, or Young Communist League. In 1947, he wrote to the party's headquarters at 16 King Street, Covent Garden, asking for a job, explaining he was very keen to be employed in a politically useful occupation, and he was taken on by the party as a shorthand typist, but within a few days had drawn suspicion onto himself by naively or foolishly phoning Scotland Yard from the party's office to inquire about his application for naturalisation, and was sacked. And this picture shows the building as it now is, a branch of HSBC, ironically. Mac moved back to the Lake District for several years, but remained a member of the party, although doubts had set in. In a letter to Emil Burns, who was head of the party's National Cultural Committee, set up in 1947, Mac wrote, "Sometimes I think that many comrades, and especially those deeply engrossed in party life, tend to imagine, rather hopefully, that the rest of the community, though they may be anti-communist or anything else, are linguistically well-equipped and politically astute. What's more, they don't always seem to be to realise that most people regard politics as not much more important than football pools or going to the pictures." We're at the next slide, please. So this is the British Road to Socialism, the party's programme adopted in 1951. In his introduction, the party's General Secretary, Harry Pollitt, wrote, "The doubts and heart-searchings felt by so many people about the present situation and the future show that the British people realise that to drift along with the existing economic and social system can offer no hope. The people of Britain can look forward to a better future only if they take their country into their own hands. This is the message of this programme." However, Mac was pulling away from the party. He wrote to his district secretary advising that he intended to leave the party, citing as a reason as hostility to the Yugoslavian communist leader Tito, who'd broken with Stalin in 1948, and also its line on the Korean War, which put the blame solely on the South Koreans. It seems that whilst believing in communism as a political idea, as a sort of theory, he was less enamoured of actual communists. Mac wrote, "Once a man starts wanting to believe in a thing, it's just about time he really set about some deep thinking. Could it be that communism is a wonderful idea, but that its philosophy is inherited with some not easily definable something that, at least in present-day society, tends rather to gather to itself mentalities of a not wholly desirable type? And if that is the case, and if communism managed to gain control in this country, just what sort of people would we expect to find governing of us?" So he returned to London, living in Kensington, and despite his doubts, reapplied to join the party. His application was handled by Betty Reed, head of the organisation department. In his obituary of Betty in The Guardian in February 2004, Labour historian Kevin Morgan described her as one of those responsible for maintaining vigilance against hostile or dissident elements. Reflecting the then atmosphere in Eastern Europe, this was a time when the party rulebook was toughened up, and Reid acquired a formidable reputation for deploying it. So Mac eventually was readmitted despite the doubts of Betty Reid. He wrote to Sam Aronovich, then full-time secretary of the Cultural Committee, asking for extra work, but MI5 recorded Reid asking Aronovich to help put Hulke off. He remained in the party after 1956, when something like a quarter of its members left after the crushing of the Hungarian uprising by Soviet tanks. But he seems to have either left or lapsed from the party by the late 60s, perhaps after the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in August 1968 to crush the Prague Spring. Mac's life stabilised in the latter part of the 1950s. Up to this point, he'd been sort of moving around a lot and having lots of different jobs. But he was now lodging at 45 Parliament Hill, Hampstead, in the house of Betty Tate, a widow and fellow communist. Mac helped out with his per-party activities, writing pamphlets for the Socialist Sunday School, selling the Daily Worker, and running the inevitable fundraising bazaars. Then Winifred Boot moved back to London from Cumberland, and she and Mac bought a house around the corner from Betty Tate at 33 South Hill Park, which they set up as a lodging house, with Mac acting as a landlord and general handyman. Mac seems to have continued living at 45 Parliament Hill until his death. And if you look online, you'll see that both these houses are now in the millions. I think it was a cheaper area in this period. Can we have the next slide, please? Mac was very involved with the socialist theatre company Unity Theatre, founded in 1935, which was housed in a former chapel in Somerstown, London. Colin Chambers, who's written the history of Unity, says that the theatre began with irrepressible determination amid the political struggles of the early 30s that were fought against the savage cuts in state benefit, the imposed means test, the waste of widespread unemployment and poverty, and above all, against the rise of fascism. Despite its non-professional status and limited size, Unity made a major and lasting contribution to the British theatre through its own work and that of its members who became professional. It pioneered direct political commentary on stage in its satires and documentary-based shows, and developed a drama that represented working class life and speech with insight and integrity. In 1954, Malcolm was listed in the annual Unity report as a production manager, and in 1961, to mark the 25th anniversary of the company, he edited a booklet entitled "Here is Drama, Behind the Scenes at the Unity Theatre." In his introduction, Mac wrote that the booklet was designed with three purposes in mind. First, as a booklet to help new active members speed up their integration into the life of Unity Theatre. A second, to answer the already active member who, after working 18 months backstage, asked if anyone knew what a production organiser did. Third, to take at least some of the Unity's faithful audience and outside supporters behind the scenes. Mac stressed that almost all jobs at Unity can be done and are done equally well and equally badly by women as well as men. And so in his pamphlet, he kind of explains how Unity works, its theory and philosophy, and also the very practical things involved in producing drama on stage. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is one of the illustrations from Here is Drama by a fellow CPGB member, Ken Sprague, for the section on The Writer. Ken did some set designs for a number of Unity productions and also contributed cartoons to the Daily Worker, the TGW Record, and many other publications and progressive causes. If you want to know a bit more about Ken, John Green wrote a book about him in 2002. Finally, Mac said, "Never write for Unity without a thorough knowledge of stage limitations and a brutal sense of economy in the presentation of ideas." And he concluded at the end of the booklet, "Unity is a theatre of ideals, but don't you be too dreamy-eyed in your approach. Only the very mature and the lonely stand the test of time." Mac does not seem to have written for Unity himself, which is surprising in a view of his later successful career as a writer. Eric Pace, with whom Malcolm worked in the 1950s and 60s, was also involved with Unity, and he did write a number of plays for the company, such as The Rosenbergs, Turn It Up, and World on Edge. We have the next still, please. Mac and Eric began writing together, and their first success was This Day in Fear, originally entitled The Executioners, which was rejected by ITV, but then taken up by the BBC and broadcast on the 1st of July in 1958 in the series Television Playwright. It was produced by George Fower, and the cast included Billy Whitelaw and Patrick McGowan. And this is a still from, or a newspaper clipping of a still from the production. And you can see Patrick McGowan there on the right. McGowan went on to play the secret agent John Drake in the very popular 1960s series Danger Man, for which Mac wrote one episode, by the way, and then created and starred in the cult TV classic The Prisoner. The main character in This Day in Fear is a former II member, having turned his back on the movement, is on the run after betraying a comrade and who seeks safety with the police. The Times described it as the most arresting yet in the series. The development is most graceful. Irony discloses in advance that the courteous and solicitous police are in fact the killers. But there is no preparation for the bombshell that the protagonist himself is the Republican hero whose death was to be avenged. The revelation of identity kaleidoscopically shakes the disconnected ends of the plot. After this early success, Mac and Eric wrote 4 plays for Armchair Theatre, as well as episodes for Gert and Daisy, which featured Elsie and Doris Waters, Tell It to the Marines, No Hiding Place, and also the script for 2 films, Life in Danger, released in 1959, and The Man in the Back Seat, released in 1961. Both films starred Darren Nesbitt, by the way. Can we have the next slide, please? Sidney Newman, head of drama at ABC, commissioned Mac and Eric to write 6 episodes of a children's science fiction serial, Target Luna, which was broadcast in April and May 1960, directed by Adrian Brown. Newman's aim was to educate young people about science, and the series centres on Professor Wedgwood, head of an experimental rocket centre which launches missions into space from Buchan Island, a remote Scottish isle. His children, Geoffrey, Valerie and little Jimmy, who have come to spend the holidays with him, become involved in the project, little Jimmy being launched into space to replace a sick astronaut, accompanied by his pet hamster, Hamlet. Mac was very keen to show a situation in which the different nations of the world unite, as he was quoted as saying, "We soon see how the plight of one human being in an earthbound rocket catches the imagination of the whole world. Radar stations, Russian, American, British and others, are linked in a global effort to bring the rocket home. Space travel, it turns out, is a great unifying influence among the nations. The old law of the sea becomes the law of space too." Target Luna was a success with the public, and Newman commissioned 3 sequels broadcast later that year: Pathfinders in Space, Pathfinders to Mars, and Pathfinders to Venus. The series was revamped with new actors playing the main roles and the children, and there was greater emphasis on science in the sequels. "This is a more ambitious story," announced Eric, with Mac adding, "we're steeped in cyanography." Unusually for this period, the cast included a woman scientist, and she's the woman in the centre here, Professor Mary Meadows, played by Pamela Barney. Can we have the next slide, please? Malcolm's connection with Sidney Newman continued when he wrote 9 episodes for the cult TV series The Avengers, which Newman had created for ABC in 1961. Howard Thomas, head of ABC, suggested to Newman that as the percentage of realistic and gloomy drama increased, their schedules needed balancing with something more light-hearted and sophisticated, something like the Thin Man films of the 30s, for instance. The Avengers ran until 1969, evolving in the course of the 60s from a black and white crime and mystery thriller to a stylish fantasy series filmed in colour, which combined English eccentricity with elements of swinging London, carefully crafted to appeal to the American market. It was originally a vehicle for Ian Hendry, following on from his role in the successful series Police Surgeon, but Hendry left after the first series, and Patrick Macnee's Steed became the lead character, accompanied between 1962 and 1964 by Kathy Gale, played by Honor Blackman, and that's who we see in the clip here, became a very popular series, and most of Mac's episodes were in this era. Cathy Gale was a departure for women characters on television in this era. Highly educated, fiercely intelligent, never put down by anyone, least of all Steed, and prone to donning black leather and throwing a miscreant across the room. And Honor especially learned judo for the role, and often people ended up with a lot of bruises if they took part. Of these 9 episodes, Mac wrote 4 with Terence Dix, whom we got to know when Terence rented a room in his house. Mac asked him to work on the scripts when he learned that Terence, an advertising copywriter, was very keen to write for television, as a lot of young people were at this period. In interviews, Terence has freely acknowledged the influence of Malcolm on his career, describing him here as his mentor. In 1968, after a spell on Crossroads, Terence became assistant script editor on Doctor Who, and about a year later, the chief script editor. I'll mention 3 episodes to give you a flavour of Mac's work on the Avengers. So, the Mauritius Penny, November 1962. Steed and Gale investigate a shadowy political group trying to seize power, whose cover is the world of stamp collecting. Intercrime, which he wrote with Terence Dix, broadcast in January 63. Steed and Gale infiltrate a crime organisation that is run as a business with targets and productivity graphs. Trojan Horse, February 1964. Set in the world of horse racing, where a stable and betting syndicate run an assassination service. Horse jockeys use special binoculars with built-in poison darts to silently dispatch the desired target in public. Could we have the next slide, please? Sidney Newman was headhunted by the BBC to be their head of drama and started work in January 1963. That year, he launched a number of new drama series, including Doctor Who, whose first episode was broadcast on the 23rd of November 1963, An Unearthly Child, which introduced the mysterious Doctor, played by veteran actor Bill Hartnell, and his grandchild Susan, played by Carol Ann Ford, who we discover are wanderers in time and space. It was the second serial set on a dead planet called Skaro, which introduced the Daleks, mutated beings inside a mechanized transport device, which caught the imagination of a whole generation of young people, including me, aged 8. The series became very popular, and some of them are still watching it now. Bill Hartnell left the role of the Doctor in October 1966 and was replaced by Pat Troughton, who played the Doctor in a very different way, a mercurial cosmic hobo fond of playing a recorder. Could we have the next slide, please? It was in this new era that Mac's first serial for Doctor Who was broadcast in April 1967, called The Faceless Ones, co-written with David Ellis. The Doctor and his companions land at Gatwick Airport and discover that aliens masquerading as an airline called Chameleon Tours are stealing the identity of these young air passengers in order to take over the world, their own planet having been devastated in an explosion. Can we have the next slide, please? Mac's next contribution to Doctor Who was the epic 10-part serial, The War Games, broadcast in the spring of 1969, which he co-wrote with Terence Dix, in haste, because the production office had run out of scripts and needed something very urgently to fill up 10 weeks. The Doctor and his companions, Zoe, played by Wendy Padbury, and Jamie, played by Fraser Hines, land in the midst of what appears to be the First World War. The Doctor explains, "We're back in history, Jamie, one of the most terrible times on the planet Earth." But then they discover that other wars from history, such as the Roman invasion of Britain, the Mexican Revolution, and the American Civil War, are taking place in neighbouring zones. They are not on Earth at all, but on another planet where the war games are being run by an alien race, so that they can create an invincible army to conquer the galaxy, assisted by a renegade Time Lord, the War Chief. The aliens use a time and space machine to move around the zones, called a Sidrat. You might speculate that's actually TARDIS backwards. After numerous adventures, captures and escapes, the Doctor, his companions and a motley army of rebels, drawn from the different war zones, join together to attack the headquarters and defeat the aliens. In this story, Mac and Terence show war as violent, brutal and pointless, controlled by ruthless leaders who place no value on human life whatsoever, and who, whilst apparently on different sides, German, British, Yankee, Southerner, are in fact all working together. They add to this by not giving the aliens any names, only titles: the security chief, the warlord, and we never learn the name of their planet, which is only ever referred to as the home planet. The War Games was Pat Troughton's last serial. His replacement was John Pertwee. And can we have the next slide, please? After declining audiences in the late 60s, Doctor Who was reborn in 1970, drawn forward by script editor Terence Dicks, good friend of Max, and the new producer Barry Letts, who formed a close, creative working relationship, instrumental in popularising Doctor Who to a fresh audience over the next 4 years. Mac contributed 6 serials in this era, serials which often have a political dimension. Terence Dicks said in an interview, "What we never did was commission a Doctor Who with a political message. But nonetheless, if you look at it, there is a streak of anti-authoritarianism in Mac's work. He doesn't trust the establishment." And Barry Letts concurred. You could be pretty certain that anything that he wrote would have an underlying political message, which we didn't mind because we like stories to have a reason. Mac said himself of Doctor Who, "It's a very political show. Remember what politics refers to. It refers to relationships between groups of people. It doesn't necessarily mean left or right. So all Doctor Whos are political, even though the other group of people are reptiles. They're still a group of people." The reptiles in question were the Silurians, an ancient race of highly intelligent reptiles who'd ruled the Earth millions of years before the evolution of the human race, but had gone into underground hibernation when they believed an approaching asteroid would destroy all life on the surface, and never woken up. In Mac's 1970 serial, The Silurians, they are awoken in caves below a nuclear power plant. The Silurians want their planet back, but the humans are fearful of this alien invasion from below. Despite the best efforts of the Doctor to broker a peace, suspicions on both sides grow, and in the end, his efforts end in failure when Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart orders the destruction of the Silurians' base. The Doctor explains, "That's murder. They're intelligent alien beings, a whole race of them, and he's just wiped them out." Mac brought them back in the Sea Devils in 1972, this time as an underwater race, whose story also ends in tragedy. Could we have the next slide, please? In Frontier in Space, shown in 1973, the Doctor and his companion Jo Grant, played by Katie, who we heard earlier, land in the 26th century, where the Earth and the Draconian Empire are on the verge of war after a series of attacks on their spaceships, which each blame on the other. The Doctor and Jo are treated as spies. It turns out the Doctor's archenemy, the Master, played by Roger Delgado, is seeking to provoke a war and move in unimpeded with his allies the Daleks to conquer the galaxy. The Doctor finally convinces the humans and Draconians of the real threat, and the joint expedition defeats the Master. This storyline is surely shaped by the Cold War, when the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, faced up to each other with their huge arsenals. The Doctor tells the Draconian Emperor, "Fear breeds hatred, Your Majesty. Fear is the greatest enemy of them all. For fear leads us to war." I love the line that Mac gives to one of the Draconians. "The ways of the Earthmen are devious. They are an inscrutable species." Mac's final serial for Doctor Who was Invasion of the Dinosaurs, broadcast in 1974, which has a strong environmental theme. And at the end, the Doctor says, "It's not the oil and the filth and the poisonous chemicals which are the real causes of the pollution. It's simply greed." That same year, Mac won an award for his work on Doctor Who and the annual Writers Guild of Great Britain Awards for the best children's drama script, along with Robert Holmes, Terry Nation, and Robert Sloman. The production team of Doctor Who changed. Terence Dicks and Barry Letts moved on, and the show changed, veering towards more gothic, traditional storylines drawn from horror films. And Mac was not asked to write in this new era. Can we have the next slide, please? In addition to his work on the television show, Mac also co-wrote The Making of Doctor Who with Terence Dicks, first published in 1972, which explained how the programme was made and its history. And he also wrote 7 Doctor Who novels for Target, 6 of which were based on his own work. And as Katie mentioned earlier, the other one was The Green Death, whose television script was written by Robert Sloman. The two remaining stories which he'd written for the series, The Ambassadors of Death and The Faceless Ones, were later turned into novels by his good friend Terence Dix after Mac's death. Malcolm Hulke Doctor Who novels are more than just a straight retelling of the story. He often adds in extra scenes or references, sometimes alters the plot, and awards even minor characters a backstory. Ben Aronovich, both of whose parents were in the Communist Party, wrote in his introduction to his novel of his own Doctor Who serial, Remembrance of the Daleks, that he was given a copy of Mac's novel Doctor Who and the Doomsday Weapon, based on Colony in Space, by his mother. He says, she approved of Hulke because she knew him through the party, which outweighed the fact that it was science fiction, a genre she despised. Could we have the next slide, please? Mac's book, Writing for Television, was first published in 1974. In this book, he drew on 25 years of writing experience to explain how television drama was made and the craft involved to write for television. Naturally, he encouraged young writers to join the union, the Writers' Guild of Great Britain. Andrew Cartmel, script editor of Doctor Who from 87 to 89, says of this book, I still remember Malcolm Hulke's book about writing for television, a glossy black hardcover with a red typewriter on the cover. It was packed with good advice. Keep your submission letter. These days it would be a submission email, very short and to the point. And also schooled me in the arcane script formatting that was de rigueur in those days. You kept a vertical slab of half the page blank, theoretically, so that camera directions could be written in. It was a practical guide and also an inspiration. It was my Bible. And my thanks in no small measure to it and to Hulke's common sense guidance. It was only a few years before I found myself working as the script editor on Doctor Who, where I discovered that the same Malcolm Hulke had been one of the mainstays of the writing team during the golden age of this show. Can we have the next slide, please? The Writers' Guild of Great Britain is a trade union which was formed on the 13th of May 1959. Mac was an active member. In 1960, for instance, he and Peter Yeldham edited the first 3 issues of the union's new quarterly newsletter, Guild News. In May 1960, he and Eric Pace took part in a meeting at the Arts Theatre, organised by the Guild's Associate Members Committee, who invited some leading writers to come along and be questioned by any of the associate members who cared to attend, and some 70 turned up. The other writers who attended were Zita Dundas, Dennis Norden, J.B. Williams, Michael Pertway, and Ray Galton and Alan Simpson. It said in the stage, after a short introduction by John Boland, the meeting took on the form of an enormous get-together, without refreshment, unfortunately, and members mixed and talked freely with each other during the next 2.5 hours. After some members complained that the 1967 AGM had been dull, Mac robustly defended the union in a letter to Guild News. The truth is that the Guild is no longer a novelty. It is a firmly established trade union digging its own roots into the corporate labour movement. When guest speaker George Elvin, General Secretary of ACTT, reminded us that we are workers, not one of the gentlemen of letters walked out. We are beginning to understand what it's all about. We showed that we could debate without hysterics, and our chairman, David Whittaker, showed he had read his Walter Sittrey. What emerged was this guild of mainly freelance writers, who professionally are often in competition with each other, has now become a mature and well-organised trade union and a credit to the trade union movement. This is a remarkable and extraordinary feat. Militancy is not only achieved by passionate declarations, and worker solidarity is not only achieved by slagging matches between platform and floor. The strength of a trade union is finally measured by the unity within its own ranks. We witnessed that unity in good measure at our AGM. By the Walter Sittrey wrote a book, ABC of Chairmanship, that's the reference there. On the 22nd of March 1968, Mac represented the Guild at the first awards ceremony held by the Australian Writers Guild in Sydney, whilst he was working in Australia on a series he'd helped to create called Rubinder on Animal Doctor. In 1969, Mac edited the Writer's Guide produced by the Guild for aspiring writers, which quickly sold out. The idea had come from David Whittaker, then chair of the Guild. Mack cited 3 reasons for publishing the manual: set down details of the network of agreements negotiated by the Guild, to provide an opportunity for some of our leading and most talented members to say something about their work, and to provide members with expert advice on taxation, copyright, censorship, etc. Mack also edited a second edition which appeared in 1970 and which included the following upbeat assessment: the Guild is strong. It needs to be stronger. It is essential that anyone who works in film, television or radio joins immediately, because individually we are nothing. Collectively, we can win for ourselves proper recompense commensurate with the inestimable contribution we make to our society. Can we have the next slide, please? Mack died on the 6th of July 1979, aged just 54. Terence Dick recalled that as a convinced atheist, Mack had left orders that there was to be no priest, no hymns, or any other ceremony at his funeral, and therefore his friends sat by the coffin, not knowing what to do. Finally, Eric Pace stood up, slapped the coffin and said, "Well, cheerio, Mack," and wandered out, and we all followed him. The stage carried an obituary, which we got on screen here, which noted his work as Eric Pace in the late 50s, and then branching out on his own in the 60s. It also recorded that he was a passionate crusader for the rights of the writer and a man, as Eric Pace confirms, of restless creative energy. I have 2 final thoughts. Firstly, that a common theme in a good deal of Mack's work was illusion and deception. The police, in this day and fear, are not the police. The stamp collectors in the Mauritius Penny are not harmless philatelists. The aircrew in the Faceless Ones are not human, and the generals in the war games are aliens, and so on. Its message to the audience: question what you think you see, or what you're being told by the powerful. Ask yourself, what is really going on? And as the Doctor says in the Faceless Ones, things are not always what they seem. I'd also suggested in his non-fiction writings, Here is Drama, The Making of Doctor Who, The Writer's Guide, and writing for television, he seeks to demystify, to hack through the technical jargon and accretions of tradition and custom and practice, and help the reader understand what are complex topics. As he wrote in the first chapter of Writing for Television, which he called What You Don't Know, You Don't Know, the more we learn about a complex subject, the more we realise there is to learn. And we can only start when we acknowledge there is something to learn. The final word should go to his good friend Terence Dix. He was a very kind and generous man. And so this concludes my very brief survey of the work of Malcolm Hulke. I've left out a good deal, and there's many other series that we could talk about which he contributed to. A series called United, and a very interesting series he did in Australia that I'd like to know more about, Rubinder, Animal Doctor. But the time is limited, and let's see how we get on with a few questions.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael. We're developing a tradition of, yes, those who know where to find the applause button down on the reactions thing can show their appreciation to you. Michael gave a talk to us a few years ago on this topic, but he carries on his research, and there clearly is still more to be found out. So maybe we'll have you back for a third occasion, Michael, in a few more years' time. But thank you very much for all you've shared with us so far. Now let's have a look at the chat and see if we've got any questions. If you can see the chat button down at the bottom, folks, if you've got a question for Michael or a comment, then do please type it in there. If you're not confident with that, you can try giving me a wave, and I'll have a look out for you. Have we got any questions so far? Okay, right. There's one for you, Michael. Can you see that from Biddy?
I had no idea he was so prolific. Is there any indication of his thoughts on creating what was at that time a fairly adult series for children? Did you mean Doctor Who, Billy?
Yeah, she's nodding.
Oh, right. I can't see her. I just see the questions. No, I think, yeah, I mean, I think Doctor Who was interesting because it was clearly, it was intended to be for children, and in some ways it's a very direct descendant rather, of Pathfinder to Space. I nobody expected it to last for 57 years. But so it was intended originally for children, to teach them about science, and the idea was to mix science fiction with history. So in the early years, it alternated. There'd be one sort of science fiction type story, and then the next one would be history. So they looked at the French Revolution, the Aztecs, and so on. So it was kind of educational. So he says, in an interview, he says that it was the Daleks that really changed it. So the sort of educational side of it started to dwindle off, and eventually stopped doing the history ones and just had science fiction. So he thought really was the popularity of the Daleks against Sidney Newman, really wanted to be educational, was quite angry until they realised just how popular the Daleks were. And you could buy everything from a sort of Dalek bedspread to Dalek toys. And Terry Nation very cannily kind of copyrighted the Daleks, and so he made a huge amount of money out of the Daleks and not the BBC.
You've got to hope that Franklin's asking, if you've written a book on Hulke, you have to hope he's a publisher, I think, Michael.
I did do the pamphlet a few years ago for Five Leagues Press, and what I'm going to do when I finish this work is put it on my blog, Fantasies of Possibility. So I'm hoping that perhaps someone will see it and do more work. There's a lot more work to be done in the BBC Written Archives, in the Writers Guild, whose archives, I think, at the Warwick Record Centre. I mean, sadly, really, his contemporaries have all gone. Terence Dicks died a few months ago. Was it last year? It's hard to remember now, in our sort of lockdown state. So people actually worked with are all gone, I think. So because Katie's one of the few people I've met who actually met him, who's still with us. Did the BBC ever give him any earache over his political views? Well, it's interesting because one of the things is, people may not know this, but people who worked or wrote for the BBC were politically vetted, and this started as far back as 1935. The BBC had a relationship with MI5, and so carried out vetting on all sorts of people for many years, right up to the 90s. And they always lied about it. They always denied it was taking place. But there's a very good article about it on the BBC, ironically, on the BBC's own website a couple of years ago, which looks at what was going on and how many people were refused. Even in the 1970s, people were refused jobs because of their politics. It's kind of interesting that both Eric and Mac somehow got through. I'm not quite sure why, but not everybody could be stopped from working, I suppose. Did he write, someone saying from Kenneth, did he write any more drama, more obviously based on contemporary society or politics? I mean, there's work on Armchair Theatre tended to be set in, the era that he was writing in. So he wrote one called The Big Client with Ian Bannon, which is about the advertising industry. I didn't have time to mention that both Eric and Terence Dicks and Mac himself all worked in the advertising world of advertising, and so The Big Client is set in the world of advertising. And so the Armchair Theatre was consciously designed by Sidney Newman to focus on social issues. Someone's saying, I love your thoughts on the brainwashing section of Invasion of the Dinosaurs around Sarah Jane on the spaceship. So for those of you who unaccountably haven't seen Invasion of the Dinosaurs, the Doctor and Sarah arrive in a London which is empty and being sort of paraded around by dinosaurs. It turns out there's a plot to get rid of the population and then send London and perhaps the world back into a golden age. And it's going to be repopulated by people they think they're in a spaceship, but actually the spaceship has never left England, they're in a cellar somewhere. So it's about truth and deceit, and what you think you're in isn't really what you're in. So it kind of fits into that, I think. Kind of complicated storyline, which is why I skipped over it in my talk. What's the theme tune written by a communist? Of Doctor Who, I assume? No. It was kind of put together by the wonderful Delia Derbyshire, which I recommend you find out more about her. If the Avengers was also aimed in America, would it have been commissioned re as politics? Well, the sort of the Avengers had a huge number of writers, so he was just one of many. And although there's a kind of subtext there, I don't think it affected their sales, and it was sort of, particularly in the latter period when it's filmed and looks very good even now, that it sold very well. It kind of fitted into how the Americans thought that Britain was, with the sort of Steed character and his bowler hat, and becomes increasingly kind of fantastical in its storylines, which is probably why that Mac wasn't writing for it after 1965.
If anybody wants to wave at me, I'll do a quick scroll through and see.
Question from Mark: was there any particular reason that Mac did not write for Doctor Who after Pertwee? Was under the impression that he and Bob Holmes got on very well. I don't know about their relationship. I have no reason to think not, but I think they Bob Holmes and the producer, whose name suddenly deserted me, I should know. Philip Hinchcliffe, took the show in quite a different way. So they started to look back, particularly with Tom Baker coming in, to more kind of looking for more traditional kind of tropes around sort of classic horror, Dracula, Frankenstein, vampires, things like that. So I don't think his kind of storyline would have fitted in with this new era. And also, people, when they take over a series, want to bring in fresh writers and give them a chance. Someone saying their cousin's a Doctor Who fanatic and would love this talk. Well, but yeah, we are going to be putting it, as Annette said, on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days, hopefully. I guess.
Yes. Hopefully this afternoon, if Zoom deliver it to me fast, which they usually do. So yeah, youtube.com/WCM Library. We're hoping to have it up later today. And we also put the link on the events page on the website, so you can get back to it that way as well. Oh, and Jane's just told everyone exactly the same thing in the chat. Thank you very much, Jane. 2 minds with a single thought. Do we have anybody else who wants to make a contribution? I'm zipping through all the little figures. Nobody is waving at me. So well, we've had a treat today. We've had Katie Manning as well as an expert talking about Doctor Who. So we've had the from both sides of the participation in Doctor Who and the viewing of Doctor Who. We've covered both. So anything you'd like to say as a final comment, Michael?
Well, firstly, thanks to yourselves for keeping things going at the library and in this sort of very difficult time for everybody. So it's been really good to have, and we kind of learned a lot, I think, from having our talks, which reached, to be honest, a much bigger audience than we possibly. So we make whenever we come back to land back on Earth from lockdown, then we can perhaps combine both the sort of physical talks and putting them perhaps live stream them if we have that technology. So I'm glad that everyone found the talk interesting from the comments here, and there's a great deal to be said about Mac. So I'll be putting it up on my blog, Fantasies of Possibility, in a couple of weeks' time when I finish the final work on it until the next regeneration.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Michael. That's brilliant. More applause coming in there virtually. So we've got the next in our Invisible Histories talk series next Wednesday at the same time. So that's going to be the 17th of June at 2 o'clock. And we have Ian Bullock speaking about his new book, which is called Drums of Armageddon, which focuses on how the outbreak of World War I was covered in the 3 main socialist weeklies of the time: Clarion, Labour Leader and Justice. So a very different Invisible History, but we do hope that you will all want to come back and join us for that. And if you missed the start of today, as we say, do head to our YouTube channel later today when we'll have that up and running, youtube.com/WCM Library. And a quick mention again that, as you know, these talks are free, but if you are able to donate, and again, many thanks to those of you who are doing it very regularly, we do appreciate that. If you're able to, there's a donate button on our website. So thank you again to Michael and to Joe and to all, Joe, there's Freudian slip, Katie, and to everybody viewing today. And goodbye till the same time next week. Take care, in solidarity, all the best from the Working Class Movement Library.